Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everyone around you is wearing a mask. Not the physical kind, but something far more insidious. You notice it first in your partner's forced smile at breakfast, then in your colleague's eager nod during the morning meeting, and finally in your own reflection as you practice what to say before an important phone call. The realization hits you like a cold wave. You've been living in a theater of deception where everyone, including yourself, has forgotten their acting. But here's the disturbing truth that will haunt you once you see it. This isn't a new phenomenon. Over 150 years ago, a philosopher with piercing eyes and an uncompromising mind saw through this elaborate masquerade with such clarity that his insight still cut through human pretense like a blade through silk. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't just observe human behavior, he dissected it, revealing the psychological machinery that drives our every interaction, our every choice, our every desperate attempt to hide from ourselves. You think you know people. You believe you can read the room, understand motivations, predict reactions. But what if everything you think you know about human nature is built on a foundation of comfortable lies? What if the person you trust most is the one hiding the deepest secrets? What if the confidence you see in others is merely the most convincing performance of terror you've ever witnessed? Consider this unsettling possibility. Every conversation you've had today was layered with unspoken calculations. Your friend who seemed so genuinely interested in your problems was simultaneously measuring how your struggles compared to their own. Your boss who praised your work was already planning how to take credit for your ideas. Even your own responses were carefully curated versions of what you thought others wanted to hear, filtered through decades of conditioning about who you're supposed to be. Nietzsche saw this psychological chess game being played out in every human interaction, and he mapped its rules with terrifying precision. He identified 18 fundamental truths about human psychology that, once understood, transform you from a naive participant in life's theater into someone who can see behind every mask, including your own. These aren't mere observations. They're keys to a hidden dimension of reality where people's true motivations, fears, and desires operate in the shadows of consciousness. But here's what makes this knowledge both powerful and dangerous. Once you learn to truly read people using Nietzsche's insights, you can never unsee what you've discovered. You'll recognize the desperate hunger for validation behind aggressive confidence. You'll spot the profound loneliness masked as independence. You'll see how people's greatest strengths are often elaborate compensations for their deepest wounds. And most unnervingly, you'll begin to understand the intricate ways you've been deceiving yourself. The question that should keep you awake tonight is this: are you ready to see people, including yourself, as they really are? Are you prepared to discover that the human experience is far more complex, contradictory, and psychologically rich than you ever imagined? Can you handle knowing that every person you encounter is simultaneously hero and villain in their own internal drama, playing out scripts written by forces they don't even recognize? Nietzsche believed that most people sleepwalk through life, never truly awakening to the psychological forces that control them. They react instead of respond, follow instead of lead, and most tragically, never discover who they actually are beneath the layers of social conditioning and self-deception. But for those brave enough to peer behind the curtain of human behavior, for those willing to confront uncomfortable truths about motivation and desire, there exists a kind of psychological superpower. The ability to navigate the complex web of human relationships with unprecedented clarity and effectiveness. The 18 psychological truths you're about to discover will forever change how you interact with others and, perhaps more importantly, how you understand yourself. They will reveal why people say one thing but mean another, why they pursue goals that make them miserable, and why they often sabotage the very things they claim to want most. These insights will show you the hidden puppet strings of human behavior and, ultimately, how to cut your own strings free. But first, you must be willing to face a disturbing reality about the nature of human psychology itself, one that will challenge everything You thought you knew about why people do what they do. The hidden problem that Nietzsche identified runs deeper than mere social politeness or white lies. It's a fundamental fracture in human consciousness itself. We live in what he called a state of psychological self-estrangement, where the person you believe yourself to be exists in constant conflict with the forces actually driving your behavior. This isn't simply about being dishonest with others. It's about the terrifying possibility that you've become a stranger to yourself. Consider the last time you felt genuinely angry, not annoyed or frustrated, but truly deeply angry. Now ask yourself, what were you really angry about? Nietzsche would argue that your surface explanation, the rude comment, the unfair treatment, the broken promise, was merely the trigger, not the source. The real anger, he observed, almost always stems from a wound to your sense of identity, a threat to the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. But here's the psychological trap. You can't acknowledge this deeper truth because it would force you to confront aspects of yourself you've spent years trying to ignore. This is what Nietzsche called the will to power, not a crude desire to dominate others, but a fundamental drive to assert and expand your sense of self, to feel significant and valuable in a universe that seems indifferent to your existence. Every human interaction becomes a subtle battlefield where people unconsciously compete for psychological territory, whose perspective will dominate, whose needs will be prioritized, whose version of reality will be accepted as truth. Jean-Paul Sartre later built upon this insight when he wrote about bad faith, the unconscious process by which people deceive themselves about their own motivations. You tell yourself you're helping others when you're actually seeking validation. You claim to value honesty while carefully curating which truths you're willing to face. You pursue relationships not out of love, but out of a terror of being alone with yourself. The most disturbing part? These self-deceptions aren't conscious lies. They're psychological survival mechanisms that operate below the threshold of awareness. Arthur Schopenhauer, who deeply influenced Nietzsche's thinking, identified this as the fundamental tragedy of human existence. We are driven by unconscious forces, what he called the will, that we mistake for conscious choice. You think you're choosing your career, your relationships, your lifestyle, but Schopenhauer would argue that these choices are actually the result of deeper psychological needs you're not even aware of having. The successful businessman isn't really pursuing wealth. He's trying to prove his worth to a father who never showed approval. The serial romantic isn't seeking love. She's attempting to heal a childhood wound through the temporary validation of conquest. Nietzsche took this insight further, recognizing that modern society has created what he termed the herd mentality, a psychological configuration where people derive their sense of identity not from authentic self-discovery, but from conformity to group values. This creates a peculiar form of psychological imprisonment. You become terrified of your own genuine thoughts and feelings because they might separate you from the safety of belonging. So you learn to read social cues obsessively, not to understand others, but to know how to perform the version of yourself that will be accepted. This is why most people are extraordinarily difficult to read, not because they're mysterious or complex, but because they themselves don't know who they are beneath their performance. They've become so skilled at adapting to social expectations that they've lost touch with their authentic desires, fears, and motivations. Carl Jung called this the development of a persona, a social mask that eventually becomes so convincing that even the wearer forgets it's not their real face. But here's where Nietzsche's psychological insights become truly revolutionary. He realized that this self-estrangement isn't a personal failing. It's a systemic feature of how consciousness itself develops. From the moment you learn language, you begin to interpret your inner experience through concepts and categories that were created by other people. You learn to feel guilty about desires that society deems inappropriate, to be ashamed of thoughts that don't align with cultural values, to suppress aspects of yourself that might threaten your social standing. The result is what Nietzsche called ressentiment, a deep psychological resentment that people harbor not just toward others, but toward life itself. This isn't simple anger. It's a corrosive emotional state where people become addicted to feeling wronged, victimized, or underappreciated because these feelings provide a sense of moral superiority that compensates for their underlying powerlessness. You can see this in how people eagerly collect grievances, how they seem to enjoy recounting stories of mistreatment, how they find identity in their suffering rather than their strength. The most insidious aspect of this psychological configuration is that it makes people predictable in their unpredictability. They will consistently act against their own stated interests, sabotage relationships they claim to value, and pursue goals that make them miserable, all while maintaining elaborate explanations for why their lives aren't working. They become trapped in what Nietzsche saw as a form of psychological sleepwalking, going through the motions of living while remaining fundamentally disconnected from their own authentic experience. This creates the perfect conditions for those who understand these psychological dynamics to read people with startling accuracy. When you recognize that most human behavior is driven by unconscious needs for validation, significance, and psychological safety, patterns become visible that were previously hidden. The seemingly random becomes predictable, the mysterious becomes transparent, and the complex web of human motivation reveals its underlying structure. But recognizing this psychological imprisonment in others inevitably leads to a disturbing question. What unconscious forces are currently shaping your own behavior without your awareness? The psychological blindness Nietzsche identified doesn't just affect individual relationships. It creates a cascading series of consequences that reshape entire societies, economies, and cultures in ways so subtle that we mistake them for natural laws of human existence. You live in a world where the majority of human suffering is self-created, yet people remain convinced that their problems come from external sources. This collective delusion produces what might be the most tragic irony of modern life. The very solutions people pursue to escape their psychological prisons only reinforce the bars. Watch how this plays out in the phenomenon of what psychologists now call hedonic adaptation. You believe that achieving certain goals, the promotion, the relationship, the recognition, will fundamentally change how you feel about yourself. But Nietzsche understood that these external achievements can never resolve internal psychological conflicts. Instead, they create a more sophisticated form of the same underlying dissatisfaction. The successful person becomes terrified of losing their success. The loved person becomes obsessed with whether they're loved enough. The recognized person becomes addicted to recognition, requiring ever-increasing doses to maintain the same psychological effect. This creates what we might call the treadmill of psychological compensation, a cycle where people run faster and faster toward goals that recede at the same pace as their approach. The ambitious executive works 18-hour days, not because they love their work, but because stopping would force them to confront the emptiness they're running from. The social media influencer posts constantly, not because they enjoy sharing, but because the validation hits provide temporary relief from a deeper sense of inadequacy. The perfectionist organizes obsessively not because they value order, but because control over their environment creates an illusion of control over their inner chaos. Nietzsche recognized that this psychological dynamic produces what he called slave morality, a value system where people derive their sense of worth, not from their own achievements and growth, but from comparing themselves favorably to others. This isn't simply about competition. It's about a more insidious form of psychological dependence where your self-esteem becomes hostage to other people's failures. You feel better about your marriage when your friends get divorced. You feel more successful when your colleagues struggle. You feel more attractive when you're surrounded by people you consider less attractive. The neurological reality behind this behavior is startling. Research in cognitive neuroscience shows that the brain's reward centers respond more strongly to relative gains than absolute ones. Your psychological satisfaction depends less on what you have and more on having more than others. This creates a zero-sum approach to happiness where other people's success becomes a threat to your own psychological well-being. Entire industries, from luxury goods to social media platforms, are built on exploiting this cognitive bias, creating artificial scarcity and comparison opportunities that keep people trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. But the most devastating consequence is how this psychological configuration affects your ability to form genuine connections with other people. When your sense of self depends on maintaining a certain image, every relationship becomes a performance space rather than a meeting ground. You can't afford to be vulnerable because vulnerability might reveal aspects of yourself that don't align with your carefully constructed persona. You can't afford to be truly curious about others because their authentic selves might challenge the stories you tell yourself about your own superiority or specialness. This creates what sociologists call the loneliness epidemic. Millions of people surrounded by others yet fundamentally isolated by their own psychological defenses. The tragic irony is that the very strategies people use to protect themselves from rejection guarantee a form of rejection that's even more painful. Being accepted for someone you're not while your authentic self remains unseen and unknown. Nietzsche saw how this individual psychological prison creates collective cultural phenomena that seem mysterious until you understand their psychological roots. The rise of what he called nihilism, not just philosophical meaninglessness, but a deep cultural exhaustion that comes from pursuing goals that provide no lasting satisfaction. Modern consumer culture, with its promise that the right products will solve internal problems. Political movements that offer the intoxicating feeling of righteousness while requiring no actual personal transformation. Therapeutic cultures that encourage endless self-analysis without demanding authentic change. The most unsettling aspect of these consequences is how they become self-reinforcing. People who are psychologically imprisoned begin to imprison others, not out of malice, but as an unconscious strategy for validating their own choices. Parents who sacrifice their dreams pressure their children to make similar sacrifices. Partners who settled for unfulfilling relationships become threatened by friends who pursue authentic love. Communities that have accepted certain limitations become hostile to members who transcend those limitations. This creates what systems theorists call homeostatic resistance, as social and psychological pressure to maintain the status quo because change in one person threatens everyone else's comfortable justifications. You've probably experienced this when you've tried to make positive changes in your life. The people closest to you, often unconsciously, began to sabotage your efforts or make you feel guilty for growing beyond the role they needed you to play in their own psychological drama. The cumulative effect is a society where authentic self-knowledge becomes increasingly rare and increasingly threatening. People develop what we might call allergy to truth, a psychological immune response that activates whenever they encounter information that might force them to confront their own self-deceptions. They become experts at explaining away evidence that contradicts their self-image, dismissing insights that might require them to change, and avoiding situations that might reveal aspects of themselves they're not ready to face. Yet it's precisely this resistance to truth that creates the opportunity for those who understand these psychological dynamics to read people with uncanny accuracy. When you recognize the patterns of self-deception, the strategies of psychological avoidance, and the unconscious drives that shape behavior, human actions become far more predictable than most people realize. The question that emerges from this analysis is both liberating and terrifying. If these psychological prisons are self-created, can they also be self-destroyed? The path out of psychological prison begins with a single terrifying act of courage. You must learn to see yourself as clearly as you see others. Nietzsche called this process becoming who you are, not discovering some predetermined identity, but actively creating yourself through conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. This isn't self-improvement in the conventional sense. It's psychological revolution, a complete overthrow of the internal systems that have been governing your life without your permission. The first rebellion is against your own explanations. Every time you catch yourself saying, "I had to," or "I couldn't help it," or "that's just how I am," you're witnessing the voice of psychological imprisonment. Nietzsche insisted that human beings have far more choice than they're willing to acknowledge. But accepting this freedom is terrifying because it eliminates the comfortable excuses that protect us from responsibility. The moment you recognize that your reactions are choices, that your anger is chosen, your fear is chosen, your happiness is chosen, you begin to reclaim the power you've been unconsciously giving away. This requires developing what we might call psychological courage, the willingness to examine your own motivations with the same ruthless honesty you apply to others. Start paying attention to the gap between what you say you want and what your actions actually create. Notice how often you sabotage the very things you claim to desire. Observe the ways you unconsciously manipulate situations to confirm your existing beliefs about yourself and others. This self-observation isn't about judgment or self-criticism. It's about gathering data about how your psychological machinery actually operates. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, discovered that even in the most extreme circumstances, people retain what he called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose their attitude toward what happens to them. This insight echoes Nietzsche's recognition that our suffering comes not from external events, but from our interpretation of those events. The rebellion begins when you realize that you can change your relationship to your circumstances, even when you can't change the circumstances themselves. But here's where most people get trapped again. They try to think their way out of psychological patterns that were created below the level of conscious thought. Nietzsche understood that genuine transformation requires what he called physiological psychology, changing not just how you think, but how you inhabit your body, how you breathe, how you move through space. Your psychological patterns are encoded in your posture, your facial expressions, your nervous system responses. To truly change, you must learn to read and reshape these physical manifestations of consciousness. Consider the radical practice of choosing your emotional responses in real time. The next time someone criticizes you, instead of automatically defending or attacking, pause and consciously choose how to respond. Not what to say, but how to feel. This sounds impossible until you realize that emotions, despite feeling involuntary, are actually complex processes that unfold over time, and you can intervene. In that process, if you develop the skill to catch them early enough, the most powerful tool for reading people becomes the same tool for transforming yourself. Learning to recognize the difference between authentic expression and performance. When you interact with others, notice when they're speaking from genuine experience versus when they're reciting scripts they've learned. More importantly, notice when you're doing the same. Authentic expression has a different quality. It's less polished, more spontaneous, often more vulnerable, and it tends to create genuine connection rather than social positioning. This leads to what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, the process of examining every belief, goal, and desire to determine whether it's truly yours or something you've inherited from family, culture, or social conditioning. This isn't about rejecting everything you've been taught, but about consciously choosing what to keep and what to discard. The question isn't, is this belief true? But does living according to this belief create the kind of person I want to become? History provides us with powerful examples of individuals who successfully broke free from collective psychological prisons. Consider how Rosa Parks' single act of refusing to give up her bus seat wasn't just political resistance, it was psychological rebellion against the internal voices that said she should accept mistreatment to avoid conflict, or how Steve Jobs revolutionized multiple industries by refusing to accept the assumption that people knew what they wanted. He understood that most consumer desires are manufactured rather than authentic. The rebellion accelerates when you begin to see other people's psychological patterns as clearly as your own. Instead of taking their behavior personally, you start recognizing it as the inevitable result of their own internal programming. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you compassionate in a deeper way, because you understand that everyone is fighting battles with invisible forces they don't even recognize. When someone is rude to you, you see their rudeness as information about their internal state rather than a reflection of your worth. But perhaps the most radical aspect of this psychological rebellion is learning to derive satisfaction from internal rather than external sources. Instead of needing others to validate your worth, you develop the capacity to generate your own sense of meaning and value. Instead of requiring circumstances to be perfect before you can be happy, you cultivate the ability to find interest and engagement regardless of conditions. This isn't positive thinking. It's a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience. The ultimate rebellion is against the need to be understood, approved of, or validated by others. When you no longer require external confirmation of your worth, you become free to be authentic in ways that were previously impossible. Paradoxically, this authenticity often creates deeper connections with others because people are starved for genuine human contact in a world of performances. This psychological freedom comes with a price. You can no longer blame others for your experience, hide behind comfortable victim stories, or avoid the responsibility of creating meaning in your own life. But it also comes with an extraordinary reward, the ability to read the psychological landscape of human behavior with the clarity of someone who has escaped the matrix and can see its patterns. From the outside, the question now becomes, what do you do with this unprecedented psychological clarity? The ultimate truth that Nietzsche discovered and that transforms everything once you truly grasp it is this: there is no fixed human nature. The person you think you are, the personality you believe defines you, the limitations you accept as permanent. All of these are elaborate constructions that can be consciously redesigned. You are not discovering yourself. You are creating yourself moment by moment, choice by choice, with each decision either reinforcing old patterns or forging new possibilities. This realization is simultaneously liberating and terrifying, because it destroys the last refuge of psychological comfort, the belief that you are a victim of your own nature. When you recognize that your personality is not a prison, but a work of art in progress, every interaction becomes an opportunity to sculpt yourself into someone more aligned with your deepest values and aspirations. The anxiety you thought was part of your DNA reveals itself as a learned response that can be unlearned. The anger you believed was your natural reaction shows itself to be a choice you can make differently. But here's the revelation that changes everything about how you read people. Everyone else is engaged in this same process of self-creation, whether they realize it or not. The difference is that most people are creating themselves unconsciously, allowing their personalities to be shaped by random experiences, social pressures, and inherited patterns. When you begin to create yourself consciously, you develop the ability to see the unconscious creation process happening in others with startling clarity.